Elizabeth's blood froze as the sheriff bound the Apache scout who had just saved her students from certain death. Now, she had one chance to stop his execution, even if it meant turning an entire frontier town against her. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The relentless Arizona sun blazed overhead, turning the air into a shimmering veil of heat that danced above the dusty road. It was late spring of 1878, but summer had already claimed this part of the territory, scorching the earth and baking the scattered settlements that dotted the rugged landscape. Miss Elizabeth Hargrove wiped a bead of sweat from her brow, careful not to disturb the neat bun at the nape of her neck, and continued writing on the weathered blackboard. "The Constitution," she said, her voice clear and measured, "is the foundation upon which our nation stands." Behind her, 7 children of varying ages sat on rough-hewn benches, their faces flushed from the heat despite the open windows of the small schoolhouse. Some scribbled notes with fierce concentration, while others fought against heavy eyelids. It was the final hour of lessons, and even Elizabeth felt the weight of the day pressing down on her shoulders. At 26, Elizabeth Hargrove had already dedicated 8 years of her life to education. Her slender frame belied a strength forged through determination, and though her hands were soft and uncalloused, they worked tirelessly from dawn until dusk. She wore a simple blue dress, high-collared and modest, with only a small cameo brooch at her throat, a gift from her late mother and her sole indulgence in vanity. Miss Hargrove, called young Thomas Miller, a freckle-faced boy of 11 with a perpetual cowlick, "Will we be leaving for Copper Creek tomorrow as planned?" Elizabeth set down her chalk and turned to face the class. "Yes, Thomas. Please make sure you've all packed your belongings tonight. Mr. Jenkins will be here with the stagecoach at first light." A ripple of excitement moved through the small classroom. Elizabeth's unique teaching arrangement was well known throughout the territory. Rather than serving a single community, she traveled between 3 settlements each month: Riverton, where they currently resided, Copper Creek, a mining community 20 miles west, and Fort Sullivan, a settlement near the territorial outpost another 15 miles beyond. In each location, she would stay for 10 days, teaching the children who otherwise would have no access to education. "Remember to bring your essays on the Arizona territory," she reminded them, smiling at their enthusiasm. "We'll share them during our journey." As the children gathered their belongings, Elizabeth moved to her small desk and began organizing her own materials. The traveling schoolteacher arrangement had been her idea, proposed to the territorial governor 2 years prior when she realized how many children were growing up without any formal education. The governor, impressed by her initiative and perhaps eager to demonstrate progress in civilizing the territory, had agreed to provide a modest stipend for her services. "Miss Hargrove," a small voice interrupted her thoughts. It was Sarah Williams, the youngest of her students at just 7 years old, with dark braids and solemn eyes too wise for her age. "Yes, dear. Pa says there's been talk of bandits on the Western Road." Sarah's voice trembled slightly. "He says the Mason brothers robbed another stagecoach last week." Elizabeth felt a chill despite the heat. The Mason brothers, 3 outlaws who had been terrorizing the territory for months. Their exploits were whispered about in every settlement, growing more terrible with each telling. Some said they had killed 12 men. Others claimed they had connections with corrupt officials who protected them from the law. She knelt to meet Sarah's eyes, keeping her expression calm. "Your father is right to be concerned, but Mr. Jenkins is very experienced, and Sheriff Hollister has assured us the route to Copper Creek is being patrolled." She squeezed the girl's shoulder gently. He will be perfectly safe." After the children had departed, Elizabeth remained in the empty schoolhouse, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of the wooden structure settling in the cooling evening air. She moved to the window, gazing out at the rugged landscape that had become her home. The Arizona Territory was still wild, untamed land where danger and beauty existed in equal measure. She had come west from Boston after her parents' passing, carrying little more than her books and a belief that education could transform lives. Some called her foolish, a proper Eastern lady choosing to live among settlers, miners, and soldiers in a land where comfort was scarce and refinement scarcer still. But Elizabeth had found purpose here. In the eager faces of her students, in the gratitude of parents who couldn't read themselves but dreamed of more for their children, in the small moments of discovery that unfolded each day in her traveling classroom. Tomorrow they would journey again across a landscape of red rock canyons and sparse pine, under a sky so vast it sometimes stole her breath. The Mason brothers were out there somewhere. It was true. But so were countless good people trying to build lives in this harsh but magnificent territory. Elizabeth closed her lesson book and extinguished the lamp. Whatever dangers awaited on the trail, she would face them. Her students needed her, and she would not fail them. Dawn broke in whispers of amber and gold over the eastern mountains, casting long shadows across the valley where Running Wolf had made his camp. He had risen before first light, as was his custom, watching as the stars faded and night surrendered to day. The small fire before him had burned down to embers, providing just enough heat to warm the coffee in his battered tin cup. He drank slowly, savoring the bitter warmth while his eyes scanned the terrain with practiced precision. At 34, Running Wolf's face bore the marks of a life lived beneath the unforgiving sun, deep lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting against harsh light and hard decisions. His black hair, streaked with a single band of silver at the temple D, was tied back with a leather cord. He wore a blend of traditional Apache clothing and items acquired through his work with the UIDS. Army buckskin leggings, a faded blue cavalry shirt, and moccasins that made no sound when he moved across the desert floor. For 6 years, he had served as a scout for the army, tracking hostile bands and guiding soldiers through territory they could never hope to navigate alone. It was not a role that earned him favor among his own people, many of whom viewed him as a traitor to the Apache way. Nor did it win him acceptance among the white settlers, soldiers, and prospectors who populated the territory, most of whom still regarded any Apache with suspicion or outright hostility. Running Wolf was a man caught between worlds, belonging fully to neither. He extinguished the fire with a handful of dirt and packed his meager belongings with efficiency. 3 days ago, he had picked up the trail of the Mason brothers near Fort Sullivan. The outlaws had robbed a supply wagon, killing the driver and stealing a shipment of rifles meant for the army. Captain Reynolds had summoned Running Wolf, asking him to track the bandits. "These men are becoming too bold," Reynolds had said, his voice tight with frustration. "The territorial governor is receiving complaints daily. We need to make an example of them." Running Wolf had nodded without comment. He understood what remained unspoken, that as an Apache, he was expendable in ways that soldiers were not. If he died in pursuit of the Mason brothers, it would be considered unfortunate but acceptable. A fair trade, perhaps, in the eyes of men who still remembered the bloody raids of Cochise and Geronimo. He mounted his horse, a sturdy pinto with intelligent eyes and sure footing, and headed west. The Mason brothers were moving toward Copper Creek. He was certain of it. Their tracks told the story of men who believed themselves untouchable, who no longer bothered to conceal their passage. 3 horses, heavily laden, moving at a steady pace. One horse with a distinctive gait, limping slightly on its right foreleg. Running Wolf followed at a distance, reading the land as others might read a book. A disturbed patch of earth where they had made camp, remnants of a jackrabbit they had roasted, the discarded remnants of a whiskey bottle smashed against stone. They were growing careless, and careless men made mistakes. By midday, he had reached a high ridge overlooking a stretch of road that wound between towering red rock formations. It was an ideal place for an ambush. Limited visibility, few escape routes, and plenty of cover for those lying in wait. Running Wolf dismounted, tethering his horse to a scrub pine, and crept forward on foot until he had a clear view of the canyon below. There they were, 3 men positioned strategically among the rocks. The Mason brothers had chosen their hunting ground well. From here, they could easily target any traveler passing through the narrow defile. Running Wolf studied them through narrowed eyes. He had never seen them up close before, but their descriptions were well known throughout the territory. Ezra Mason, the eldest and leader, a tall man with a scar running from eye to jaw. Isaac, the middle brother, stocky and quick-tempered, said to be the most vicious of the 3. And young Caleb, barely 20, who had followed his brothers into a life of crime after their family lost their Texas ranch during the war. Running Wolf considered his options. He could attempt to apprehend them alone, a dangerous proposition even for a man of his skills. He could ride back to Fort Sullivan for reinforcements, but that would mean leaving the brothers free to ambush whatever unfortunate travelers came through the canyon next. Or he could find a way to warn potential victims away from the trap that had been laid. As he deliberated, the faint sound of wheels and hoofbeats reached his ears. Running Wolf edged closer to the rim of the ridge, his body tense with sudden urgency. A stagecoach was approaching from the east, moving at a steady pace toward the canyon and the waiting outlaws. Through the rising heat waves, he caught sight of the vehicle, an old Concord coach pulled by 4 horses with a driver perched high on the box. Even at this distance, he could see that it wasn't a regular mail coach or passenger service. It was smaller, less imposing, the kind of conveyance that might be chartered for a specific purpose. Running Wolf's jaw tightened as he watched it draw nearer to the ambush point. The Mason brothers had shifted now, readying their weapons, pulling bandanas up to cover their faces. Whoever was in that coach was minutes away from a confrontation that would likely end in bloodshed. He had to act quickly. The path ahead was clear in his mind, though the outcome remained uncertain. Running Wolf moved back to his horse with silent urgency, his decision made. Some would call it foolish to intervene. Others would question his motives. But deep within, Running Wolf knew his path was set by something stronger than calculation or self-interest, a code of honor that transcended the divisions between peoples, a belief that some actions were simply right, regardless of who performed them or who benefited. With a soft word to his pinto, he mounted and began picking his way down the ridge toward the canyon floor. The stagecoach bounced and swayed over the rough terrain, its wooden wheels finding every rut and stone along the dusty road. Inside, Elizabeth Hargrove steadied herself against the leather-upholstered seat, one hand gripping the window frame as the vehicle lurched particularly hard to one side. Across from her, 7 children sat in various states of discomfort and excitement, their small bodies jostling together with each bump and turn. "How much longer till Copper Creek, Miss Hargrove?" asked 10-year-old Margaret Sullivan, her normally neat blonde braids coming undone after hours of travel. Elizabeth glanced out the window at the sun's position. "Another 2 hours, I should think. We'll stop to rest the horses soon. Mr. Jenkins, their driver, had maintained a steady pace since they'd left Riverton at dawn. He was a taciturn man in his 50s with a weather-beaten face and hands that bore the calluses of a lifetime spent handling reins. Elizabeth trusted him implicitly. He had been making this journey with her and her students for nearly 2 years without incident. "I'm hungry," announced Billy Thompson, a sturdy boy of 12 whose father ran the general store in Riverton. Ma packed extra biscuits. "Anyone want to share?" The offer prompted a flurry of activity as the children reached for their own packed lunches. Elizabeth smiled at their enthusiasm, grateful for the distraction from the increasingly rough road. The terrain had changed in the past hour, the flat desert giving way to rising red rock formations that seemed to grow more imposing with each mile. "Miss Hargrove," said Thomas, peering out the window with undisguised fascination, "my pa says these canyons were made by giants who fought a great battle long ago." Elizabeth suppressed a smile. "That's a fascinating story, Thomas. The indigenous peoples of this region have many legends about how these landforms were created. In scientific terms, however, these canyons were carved by water over millions of years." "Water did all this?" asked Sarah Williams, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Indeed, water is one of the most powerful forces in nature, though it works slowly. It teaches us that persistence often accomplishes what strength alone cannot. Like learning arithmetic," offered James Parker, the oldest at 13, with a wry smile that made his freckles dance across his nose. "Precisely," Elizabeth laughed. Pleased by his insight, the coach began to slow, and Elizabeth felt a flutter of anticipation. They must be stopping for the horses to rest, as promised. She gathered her skirts, preparing to help the children disembark for a brief respite from the confines of the coach. But instead of coming to a complete stop, the vehicle jerked forward suddenly, accelerating with unexpected speed. Elizabeth grabbed the seat to steady herself as the children cried out in surprise. "Something's wrong," she said, trying to keep her voice calm despite the fear rising in her chest. Through the window, she could see Mr. Jenkins leaning forward on his seat, the reins gripped tightly in his hands, urging the horses to a pace that seemed dangerous given the narrow, winding road. "Look!" cried Margaret, pointing ahead through the dust cloud that had risen around them. "Men on horses!" Elizabeth followed her gaze and felt her blood run cold. 3 riders had appeared on the road ahead, positioned to block their path. Even at this distance, she could see the glint of metal in their hands, guns drawn and ready. Their faces were obscured by bandanas, but their intent was unmistakable. "Children, get down!" Elizabeth commanded, her teacher's authority cutting through the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. "On the floor now!" Without hesitation, the children slid from their seats onto the straw-covered floor of the coach. Elizabeth positioned herself in front of them as best she could, though she knew her slender frame offered little protection against bullets. The coach continued its desperate forward momentum, Mr. Jenkins apparently determined to break through the blockade. For one wild moment, Elizabeth thought they might succeed, and then came the sharp crack of gunfire. One of the lead horses stumbled, not hit but startled by a bullet that struck the ground near its hooves. The coach swerved violently, and Elizabeth heard Mr. Jenkins curse above the rumble of wheels and the frightened whinnying of horses. "Stay down," she whispered to the children, who huddled together in terrified silence, small hands clutching at each other. Young Sarah had begun to cry silently, tears streaming down her face, while James had positioned himself protectively in front of the smaller children, his jaw set in a determination that broke Elizabeth's heart with its premature bravery. The coach shuddered to a halt, the horses blowing hard, steam rising from their flanks in the cool canyon air. For a moment, all was silent, except for the creak of leather and wood settling. Then came the sound of approaching hoofbeats, slow and deliberate, and a voice called out with mocking cordiality, "Step down from the box, driver, nice and easy now." Elizabeth met the eyes of her students, seeing her own fear reflected 7 times over. She thought of all she had promised their parents: safety, education, a return journey in 10 days' time, promises that now seemed impossible to keep. "What do we do?" whispered Margaret, her voice barely audible. Elizabeth swallowed hard. "We stay calm," she said, though her racing heart belied her words. "Whatever happens, we stay together." Outside, boots thudded on hard-packed earth as the bandits dismounted. The stagecoach door handle rattled, and sunlight flooded the interior as it swung open. A tall figure filled the doorway, silhouetted against the harsh sunlight. Elizabeth could make out little more than a broad-shouldered outline, crowned by a wide-brimmed hat, but the revolver in his hand spoke volumes about his intentions. "Well now, what do we have here?" The man's voice carried a Texas drawl, stretched thin with amusement. He leaned in, revealing a face half hidden behind a red bandana, with cold eyes that settled first on Elizabeth, then swept over the children huddled on the floor. "Oh, dear schoolma'am and her little lambs. Ain't that sweet, Isaac?" A second man appeared beside him, shorter but broader, with a shotgun cradled in his arms. "Real sweet, Ezra. Bet they're carrying valuables, too. These education types always come from money." Elizabeth straightened her spine, summoning every ounce of courage she possessed. "We have nothing of value," she said, striving to keep her voice steady. "Just books and supplies for the children of Copper Creek." Ezra Mason, for she was certain now that these were the infamous brothers, chuckled darkly. "Oh, I doubt that, ma'am. Fine lady like yourself, traveling these parts, must have something worth our while." His eyes lingered on the cameo brooch at her throat. "That trinket, for starters." Elizabeth's hand instinctively rose to touch the brooch, her mother's last gift before succumbing to consumption 3 years prior. "Please," she said, hating the tremor in her voice, "it has only sentimental value." "Sentiment don't pay for whiskey," said Isaac with a cruel laugh. "Out of the coach, all of you, now." The third brother, younger than the others, appeared behind them, keeping watch on Mr. Jenkins, who stood with his hands raised beside the coach. "Hurry it up, Ezra," he called nervously. "This place is too exposed." Elizabeth moved first, stepping carefully from the coach to stand on shaking legs in the dust of the canyon road. The children followed, some whimpering softly, others moving in stunned silence. James kept his arm protectively around Sarah's small shoulders, his young face a mask of tightly controlled fear. "Line up," ordered Ezra, gesturing with his gun. "Empty your pockets and bags. Any valuables, coins, jewelry, watches, pile them right here." He kicked at the dirt with a dusty boot. Elizabeth watched in helpless fury as the Mason brothers ransacked the stagecoach, tossing aside books and clothing in their search for anything worth stealing. One of them found her small purse containing the monthly stipend for school supplies, $15 that represented a significant portion of her meager salary. "Please," she tried again, "that money is for the children's education." Ezra turned, his eyes narrowing above the bandana. "Lady, you're in no position to be making requests. Be grateful we ain't decided to take more than your valuables." The threat in his voice was unmistakable, and Elizabeth felt a chill despite the warm day. Little Sarah began to cry in earnest now, her small body shaking with sobs. "I want my pa!" she wailed, her voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Shut that brat up," growled Isaac, swinging his shotgun toward the child. Elizabeth moved without thinking, placing herself between the gun and Sarah. "And she's just a child," she said, her voice finding new strength in the face of this direct threat. 7 years old and frightened. Surely even men such as yourselves must have some decency. For a tense moment, she thought Isaac might strike her. His eyes blazed with a volatile mixture of anger and something darker, more unpredictable. Then Ezra laid a restraining hand on his brother's arm. "Easy now," he said. "No need for that. We get what we came for, and we ride out." He turned to Elizabeth with a mock tip of his hat. "Though I think we'll be taking that pretty brooch as a souvenir, Ma'am." Elizabeth's fingers closed around the cameo, her last physical connection to her mother. She opened her mouth to protest again when a sound cut through the tense silence, a sharp, distinctive whistle that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The Mason brothers froze, their heads swiveling in unison toward the ridge above. "What the hell was that?" muttered the youngest brother, Caleb, his gun hand visibly trembling. Before anyone could answer, a lone rider appeared on the ridge, silhouetted against the azure sky. Even at that distance, there was something unmistakable about his posture, a fluid grace that spoke of complete harmony with his mount, as though horse and rider were a single entity. "Apache," hissed Isaac, raising his shotgun toward the figure. The rider began to descend the ridge, picking his way down a path that seemed impossibly steep, yet moving with confidence that bordered on recklessness. As he drew closer, Elizabeth could make out his features, the dark hair pulled back from a face that seemed carved from the same red stone as the canyon walls, the cavalry shirt that hung loosely on his lean frame, the rifle held ready but not yet aimed. "Just one Injun," said Ezra, though there was a new tension in his voice. "Caleb, keep your gun on him." Isaac finished gathering their things, but something had changed in the atmosphere of the canyon. The children, sensing a shift in the balance of power, had stopped crying. Mr. Jenkins had taken a small step backward, away from his captors, and Elizabeth found herself holding her breath as the Apache rider continued his approach, his eyes, dark and unreadable, fixed on the scene before him. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly through the canyon air, deep and accented but perfectly comprehensible. "This ends now." Time seemed to stand still in the canyon. The Mason brothers exchanged glances, a wordless communication born of years riding together. Elizabeth could read their calculations. 1 Apache against 3 armed men seemed like favorable odds. Yet something in the stranger's demeanor gave even these hardened outlaws pause. "I'd ride on in June," Ezra called, his voice carrying a forced bravado. "This ain't your business." The Apache brought his horse to a halt 30 yards away, close enough for Elizabeth to see him clearly now. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with high cheekbones and eyes that missed nothing. A scar ran along his jawline, disappearing into the collar of his faded blue shirt. He sat with the easy confidence of a man who had faced worse odds than these and survived. "You're the Mason brothers," he stated, not a question, but a recognition. "Wanted for robbery and murder from here to Fort Sullivan." Isaac's grip tightened on his shotgun. "And who might you be, sticking your nose where it don't belong?" "I am called Running Wolf." The name hung in the air, and Elizabeth saw Mr. Jenkins stiffen in recognition. "And I track for the army at Fort Sullivan." "A scout," spat Caleb, the youngest brother, with undisguised contempt. "A traitor to your own kind." Running Wolf's expression remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes, a brief shadow of an old pain. "These children and their teacher will continue their journey unharmed," he said, ignoring the jab. "You will return what you have taken and ride away." A harsh laugh erupted from Isaac. "There's 3 of us, And one of you, Injun, you best reconsider your position." Running Wolf's gaze swept over the scene, taking in every detail: the children's frightened faces, Elizabeth's protective stance, the positions of the three outlaws. His assessment was methodical, unhurried. Then, with deliberate slowness, he raised his rifle. What happened next occurred so quickly that Elizabeth would later struggle to recall the precise sequence of events. Running Wolf fired once, not at any of the men, but at the red bandana around Ezra's neck. The fabric tore away, leaving a startled Ezra clutching at his throat, finding it unharmed but exposed. Before the echo of the shot had faded, Running Wolf had chambered another round and fired again. This time, Isaac's shotgun leapt from his hands as if yanked by an invisible string, landing in the dust several feet away. The third shot followed almost instantly, knocking Caleb's pistol from his grip with surgical precision. 3 shots, fired in less than 5 seconds, and not a drop of blood spilled. The canyon fell silent, save for the frightened whinnying of the outlaws' horses. Elizabeth stared in astonishment at Running Wolf, who had already lowered his rifle. His face betrayed no triumph, no satisfaction, only a calm resolve. "You missed," said Ezra, his voice hoarse with shock and growing anger. "No," replied Running Wolf simply. "If I had wanted you dead, you would be." The truth of this statement was undeniable. Even Elizabeth, with her limited knowledge of marksmanship, understood the extraordinary skill they had just witnessed. To shoot with such precision, disarming 3 men without harming them, required a level of expertise that bordered on the miraculous. Ezra's hand crept toward the second pistol at his hip. Running Wolf's voice cut through the tension. "The next shot will not miss you, Ezra Mason." The outlaw's hand froze. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, with a fluid motion that seemed impossibly fast for a man his size, Running Wolf dismounted, keeping his rifle trained on the brothers. "On the ground," he commanded, "face down, hands behind your backs." Caleb looked to his eldest brother for guidance, uncertainty plain on his young face. Isaac glared with naked hatred, his body tense as if contemplating a desperate lunge for his fallen shotgun. "And you can't take all 3 of us," he growled. "He won't have to," came Mr. Jenkins' steady voice. The driver had retrieved a rifle from beneath the coach seat and now stood with it leveled at the brothers. "I ain't much for fighting, but I reckon I can hit what I aim at from this distance." The odds had shifted decisively. With visible reluctance, the Mason brothers lowered themselves to the ground, fury emanating from their prostrate forms like heat from sun-baked stone. Running Wolf approached cautiously, retrieving a length of rawhide from his saddlebag. With efficient movements, he bound the outlaws, hands behind their backs, using knots that Elizabeth suspected would be impossible to work free. Only when the last brother was secured did Running Wolf turn his attention to the stagecoach passengers. His gaze met Elizabeth's, and she was struck by the depth she saw there, not the savage simplicity that frontier stereotypes had led her to expect, but a complex intelligence and an old sorrow. "Are you harmed?" he asked, his voice gentler now. Elizabeth shook her head, finding her voice. "No." "Thanks to you, we are all unharmed." She placed a protective arm around Sarah, who had stopped crying and now stared at Running Wolf with wide-eyed wonder. "You saved us, Mr. Running Wolf." Something like surprise flickered across his features at her formal address. Perhaps he was unaccustomed to being spoken to with respect by white settlers. "The children are brave," he said, nodding toward James, who stood tall despite his obvious fear. "And their teacher braver still. I saw how you placed yourself between the gun and the little one." A flush of embarrassment heated Elizabeth's cheeks. Any teacher would have done the same. Running Wolf's expression suggested he doubted this, but he made no further comment. Instead, he turned to Mr. Jenkins. "Can the coach continue to Copper Creek?" The driver nodded. "Horses are sound. Wheels too. We can make it." "Good. I will escort you there." Running Wolf glanced at the bound outlaws. "These three will ride with us. The army has been hunting them for months." The stagecoach resumed its journey through the canyon, now accompanied by 4 additional riders. Running Wolf led the way, his keen eyes constantly scanning the rugged terrain for any sign of danger. Behind the coach rode the Mason brothers, each bound to his saddle in a manner that allowed him to balance but prevented escape, their horses tethered to the rear of the vehicle. Inside the coach, the mood had transformed from terror to a strange mixture of relief and wonder. The children, resilient as only the young can be, had already begun to process their adventure, whispering among themselves and casting frequent glances out the window at their Apache rescuer. "Miss Hargrove," Thomas asked, his voice pitched low as if sharing a secret, "do you think he's killed many men?" "My pa says all Apache are bloodthirsty savages." Elizabeth felt a twinge of discomfort at the boy's innocent recitation of frontier prejudice she herself had once accepted without question. "I think, Thomas, that we should judge a man by his actions, not by stories we've heard. And today, Running Wolf saved our lives without taking another. That speaks more truly of his character than any tale." "He shoots better than anyone I've ever seen," declared James with undisguised admiration. "Even better than Sheriff Hollister, and he was in the war." "He moved so quiet," added Margaret, "like he was part of the wind itself." Elizabeth smiled at their observations. Children, she had learned, often saw clearly what adults obscured with preconception and bias. They recognized Running Wolf's skill and courage without the filter of prejudice that clouded so many adult perspectives in the territory. As the afternoon wore on, the heat intensified, turning the coach interior into an oven. Mr. Jenkins called a halt beside a small spring that bubbled from the canyon wall, providing a welcome opportunity to refresh themselves and the horses. Elizabeth helped the children down from the coach, watching as Running Wolf positioned himself where he could observe both his prisoners and the surrounding landscape. His vigilance never wavered, yet there was an ease to his posture that suggested this state of alert was natural to him, requiring no special effort. "May I offer you water?" Elizabeth asked, approaching him with a tin cup she had filled from the spring. Running Wolf turned, surprise evident in his eyes, before he carefully masked it. He accepted the cup with a slight nod. "Thank you, Miss Hargrove." "You know my name," she said, realizing she had never introduced herself. "I have heard of the traveling teacher," he replied after taking a careful sip. "Your reputation reaches even to Fort Sullivan." "I hope it's a favorable one," she said with a small smile. Something that might have been amusement flickered in his dark eyes. "They say you are stubborn, determined, that you believe all children deserve education, and you find this amusing." "No," he said, his expression growing serious. "I find it admirable. My people have always valued knowledge, though our ways of teaching differ from yours." Elizabeth was intrigued by this glimpse into his thoughts. "How so?" Before he could answer, little Sarah approached, her earlier fear apparently forgotten. She stood before Running Wolf, head tilted back to look up at his face, studying him with the frank curiosity of childhood. "Mr. Wolf," she said, mangling his name in her childish way, "can you teach me to whistle like you did?" "The whistle that scared the bad men." Elizabeth expected him to dismiss the child, but instead, Running Wolf crouched down to Sarah's level, meeting her eyes directly. "That whistle is an Apache signal," he explained, his deep voice gentled for her benefit. It tells others where you are or warns of danger. Can I learn it? Sarah persisted. Running Wolf glanced at Elizabeth as if seeking permission. When she nodded, he demonstrated a simple version of the whistle. Sarah attempted to replicate it, producing only a breathy sound that made Running Wolf's lips twitch in what might have been the beginning of a smile. Practice, he told her. All skills improve with practice. One by one, the other children gravitated toward them, drawn by Sarah's interaction with the intimidating but fascinating Apache. Soon, Running Wolf found himself surrounded by curious youngsters, bombarding him with questions that ranged from how he tracked the outlaws to whether he could understand what the birds were saying. To Elizabeth's surprise, he answered each query with patience, neither talking down to the children nor dismissing their curiosity. When Thomas asked bluntly if he had killed many men, Running Wolf grew solemn. "I have fought when I had to," he said carefully, "but taking a life is never something to boast about. Each death, even of an enemy, leaves a shadow on the heart." Elizabeth watched, fascinated, as this man, whom most in the territory would cross the street to avoid, connected with her students through simple honesty and respect. It was a side of him she suspected few white settlers ever saw, hidden as it was behind the barrier of fear and mistrust that separated their peoples. As they prepared to resume their journey, James approached Running Wolf with a piece of jerky from his lunch pail. "Sir," he said formally, "would you like some? My ma makes it special with sage and pepper." Running Wolf accepted the offering with the gravity it deserved. "Thank you, young warrior. Your mother's cooking honors me." James beamed at being called warrior, straightening his spine and returning to the coach with newfound dignity. When they were underway again, Elizabeth found herself watching Running Wolf as he rode alongside the coach. His profile against the Red Canyon walls was striking, proud but not arrogant, alert but not tense. She wondered about his life, about the path that had led him to become a scout for the army that had fought against his people. What compromises had he made? What losses had he endured? "Mr. Jenkins," she said quietly to the driver when Running Wolf had ridden ahead to check the trail. "What do you know of him?" The older man kept his eyes on the road, his leathery face giving away little. "Not much to tell, that's certain. Rumors aplenty, though. Some say he was educated at a mission before returning to his people. Others claim he fought with Cochise until something changed his mind. Army fellows say he's the best tracker in the territory, but even they don't trust him completely." Jenkins spat a stream of tobacco juice over the side of the coach. "One thing's for sure, Sheriff Hollister can't stand the sight of him." "Why is that?" Elizabeth asked, remembering the stern lawman who had assured her the route to Copper Creek was safe. "Sheriff lost his brother in an Apache raid some years back. Doesn't distinguish between hostile bands and peaceful ones. To him, an Apache is an Apache, and all of them are guilty. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains when the stagecoach rolled into Copper Creek. The settlement was larger than Riverton but lacked its rustic charm, bearing the unmistakable marks of a mining community that had sprung up overnight and grown without plan or purpose. Wooden buildings in various states of repair lined the dusty main street, punctuated by saloons whose raucous music spilled into the late afternoon air. Word of their arrival spread quickly. By the time Mr. Jenkins guided the team to a halt in front of the Copper Creek Hotel, a crowd had gathered, miners still dusty from their shifts, shopkeepers in canvas aprons, women with children clutching their skirts. Their expressions reflected a mixture of curiosity and concern, eyes widening as they took in the unusual procession. The stagecoach, Running Wolf on his pinto, and the three bound outlaws trailing behind. "Miss Hargrove!" called a burly man with a thick mustache, whom Elizabeth recognized as Mr. Donovan, the mine foreman and head of the Copper Creek School Board. "We'd begun to worry when you didn't arrive on schedule." Elizabeth descended from the coach, helping Sarah and Margaret down after her. "We encountered some trouble on the road, Mr. Donovan. The Mason brothers thought to rob us in the canyon." A murmur ran through the crowd at the mention of the infamous outlaws. People craned their necks to get a better look at the three bound men, who glowered back with undisguised hatred. "The Mason brothers," repeated Donovan, his bushy eyebrows shooting upward. "And you captured them. How in heaven's name—" "We didn't," Elizabeth interrupted, turning to gesture toward Running Wolf, who remained mounted at a slight distance, his posture alert but non-threatening. "This man saved us. His name is Running Wolf, a scout from Fort Sullivan. He tracked the outlaws, disarmed them single-handedly, and escorted us safely here." The crowd's reaction was immediate and complex. Relief at the children's safety, warring with ingrained suspicion of the Apache in their midst. Some touched their hat brims in grudging acknowledgement, others muttered to their neighbors, casting distrustful glances at Running Wolf. James, who had been helping the younger children from the coach, stepped forward with surprising boldness. "He was amazing," the boy declared. "He shot the guns right out of their hands without hurting anybody, and he knows how to track animals just by looking at the ground, and he taught Sarah a special Apache whistle, and James," Elizabeth said gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Perhaps the details can wait until everyone is settled." Mr. Donovan nodded, visibly struggling to reconcile his relief with his discomfort. Of course. You all must be exhausted. We've prepared your usual rooms at the boarding house, Miss Hargrove, and the children's parents are being notified." He hesitated, glancing at Running Wolf. "As for the Apache and these outlaws, I will take the prisoners to your jail," Running Wolf said, speaking for the first time since they'd entered the town. His voice carried clearly in the sudden hush that fell over the crowd. "They are wanted by the army and territorial authorities." Before Donovan could respond, the crowd parted to admit a tall figure in a dust-covered duster, a silver star pinned to his chest. Sheriff Thaddeus Hollister cut an imposing figure, with his broad shoulders, weathered face, and the hard set of his jaw. His pale blue eyes, cold as winter sky, fixed immediately on Running Wolf. "What's this Apache doing in my town?" he demanded, one hand resting meaningfully on the revolver at his hip. "Sheriff Hollister." Elizabeth stepped forward, determined to set the record straight before misunderstanding could escalate to something worse. "A Running Wolf saved us from the Mason brothers. He tracked them, captured them, and delivered us safely to Copper Creek. We owe him our lives." Hollister barely spared her a glance, his attention fixed on Running Wolf with an intensity that made Elizabeth's skin prickle with apprehension. "Is that so?" The sheriff's voice dripped with skepticism. "And I'm supposed to believe an Apache just happened to be tracking these outlaws out of the goodness of his heart?" "He's a scout for the army," Mr. Jenkins offered, climbing down from the driver's box. "Captain Reynolds at Fort Sullivan sent him." "I don't recall asking you, Jenkins," Hollister snapped. He strode forward, stopping a few paces from Running Wolf's horse. "I don't care who sent you. In this town, Injun, you answer to me. And I say you'll hand over those prisoners and be on your way before sundown." A tense silence fell over the gathered crowd. Elizabeth felt her heart pounding, aware of the children watching wide-eyed as the scene unfolded. Running Wolf remained still, his expression unreadable, though she imagined she could sense the calculations running behind his composed exterior. "The Mason brothers are wanted for crimes against the U.S. Army," he said finally, his voice level. I am under orders to deliver them to Fort Sullivan. Hollister's face darkened. And I'm telling you, they're staying in my jail. I've been hunting these vermin for months. I won't have some Apache scout stealing the credit for their capture. It's not about credit, Running Wolf replied with dignity that only seemed to inflame the sheriff further. Get down off that horse, Hollister growled, his hand now gripping his revolver. You're in my jurisdiction now, and I don't take orders from savages. Sheriff! Elizabeth protested, unable to contain her dismay at this blatant injustice. You can't. Stay out of this, Miss Hargrove. Hollister cut her off without looking away from Running Wolf. This is official business, and you'd do well to remember your place. Mr. Donovan placed a restraining hand on Elizabeth's arm, shaking his head in silent warning. Around them, the townspeople watched in uncomfortable silence. Few willing to challenge the sheriff's authority, even fewer willing to side with an Apache against one of their own. For a long moment, no one moved. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife, the crowd holding its collective breath as the sheriff and the Apache scout measured each other in silence. Elizabeth felt the children press closer to her, sensing the dangerous undercurrents flowing through the dusty street. With deliberate slowness, Running Wolf dismounted, his movements fluid and controlled. Standing on the ground, he was nearly as tall as Hollister, meeting the lawman's hostile gaze without flinching. The contrast between them was stark, the sheriff's aggressive posture against Running Wolf's contained dignity. The prisoners are yours, Running Wolf said finally, stepping away from his horse. I will report to Captain Reynolds that they were delivered to your custody. A flicker of disappointment crossed Hollister's face, as if he'd been hoping for resistance. Not so fast, he said, his voice carrying a new edge. How do I know you weren't working with these outlaws, setting up this whole rescue story as a cover? A ripple of confused murmurs spread through the crowd. Elizabeth stepped forward, indignation overcoming her caution. That's absurd, Sheriff. Running Wolf saved us from those men. Ask any of the children. Ask Mr. Jenkins. We all witnessed it. Hollister's cold eyes shifted to her briefly. With all due respect, Miss Hargrove, you're an Eastern woman unfamiliar with the Apache ways. They're masters of deception, been known to stage rescues just to gain trust before attacking. That's not what happened, James protested, his young voice cracking with emotion. He could have killed those outlaws, but he didn't. He could have left us there, but he didn't. Quiet, boy, Hollister snapped. You'll speak when spoken to. Mr. Donovan cleared his throat nervously. Sheriff, perhaps we should hear the children out. If they all tell the same tale, I know what I'm dealing with, Hollister cut him off. This Apache's been causing trouble throughout the territory. I've had reports. Elizabeth knew this was a lie. Running Wolf's reputation at Fort Sullivan, according to Mr. Jenkins, was impeccable. The fabrication inflamed her sense of justice. What reports exactly? She challenged, stepping closer, despite Mr. Donovan's restraining hand on her arm. Name one incident where Running Wolf has broken the law. Hollister's face darkened with anger. I don't answer to you, Miss Hargrove. Your job is teaching arithmetic, not questioning the law. He turned back to Running Wolf. Empty your pockets, slowly. Running Wolf complied without protest, producing only a small hunting knife, a worn leather pouch containing what appeared to be medicinal herbs, and a military-issued identification paper signed by Captain Reynolds. Hollister snatched the paper, glanced at it dismissively, then crumpled it and shoved it into his own pocket. Convenient. Now hand over that knife. Again, Running Wolf obeyed, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. Elizabeth watched in growing horror as she realized the sheriff's intentions. Sheriff, you can't possibly, she began. I can and I will, Hollister interrupted. Running Wolf, or whatever your real name is, I'm arresting you for suspected conspiracy with known outlaws, possession of a concealed weapon, and trespassing in Copper Creek without proper authorization." A shocked murmur ran through the crowd. Even those who harbored suspicions about the Apache seemed uncomfortable with this transparent miscarriage of justice. "Those charges are false, and you know it," Elizabeth said, her voice rising. "Now, the knife wasn't concealed. You asked him to produce it, and he has authorization as an army scout." "Miss Hargrove," Hollister's voice took on a dangerous quietness, "one more word, and I'll have you arrested for interfering with the law. Is that what you want these children to see, their teacher in a jail cell?" The threat silenced her momentarily, though her eyes blazed with righteous anger. Running Wolf, however, spoke softly. "It's all right, Miss Hargrove." His eyes met hers briefly, conveying a message she couldn't fully decipher, resignation perhaps, or a deeper wisdom about the ways of the world. "This is not the first time I have faced such treatment. It will not be the last." "Smart Injun," Hollister said with a cruel smile. "Now turn around. Hands behind your back." As the sheriff roughly bound Running Wolf's wrists with a pair of iron manacles, little Sarah began to cry, burying her face in Elizabeth's skirts. Thomas stood rigid with confusion and dismay, while James's hands had curled into helpless fists at his sides. "Why is he arresting Mr. Wolf?" Margaret whispered, tugging at Elizabeth's sleeve. "He didn't do anything wrong." Elizabeth knelt beside the girl, struggling to find words that would make sense of this injustice without destroying the child's faith in authority. "Sometimes, Margaret, people make mistakes because they're afraid or angry. Sheriff Hollister is making a mistake now, but we're going to help him understand the truth." Hollister overheard her. "Teaching sedition to children now, Miss Hargrove." "The school board might be interested to hear about that." Before she could respond, Running Wolf spoke again, his voice calm but carrying clearly to the children. "Remember what I told you about the path of honor. Sometimes it leads through difficult places, but we must follow it regardless." The sheriff shoved him roughly toward the jailhouse. "Save your Indian philosophizing. You'll have plenty of time for that behind bars." To the gathered crowd, he announced, "I'll be sending a telegram to the territorial governor about this Apache spy. We'll have a proper trial when the circuit judge arrives next week." As Hollister marched Running Wolf down the street, the Mason brothers were escorted separately by the sheriff's deputy, a young man who looked distinctly uncomfortable with the proceedings. Elizabeth noted with bitter irony that the outlaws were treated with more courtesy than their captor. The crowd began to disperse, conversations rising and falling as townspeople debated what they had witnessed. Elizabeth stood rooted to the spot, her mind racing. This couldn't be happening, not in America, not in a place that prided itself on justice and fairness, yet it was happening right before her eyes. "Miss Hargrove, Mr. Donovan approached cautiously. "I've arranged for the children to be taken to their families, and your room at Mrs. Wilson's boarding house is ready." Elizabeth nodded absently, her thoughts still with Running Wolf. "Thank you, Mr. Donovan, but I can't simply go and rest while an innocent man sits in jail for saving our lives." "I understand your feelings," Donovan said, lowering his voice, "but Hollister's not a man to cross. He holds considerable influence with the county officials, and his word carries weight." "More weight than the truth?" Elizabeth asked sharply. Donovan sighed, rubbing his mustache nervously. "The truth is complicated in these parts, Miss Hargrove, especially when it comes to relations with the Apache. The raids, the killings on both sides, wounds are still fresh." "Running Wolf isn't responsible for those raids," she insisted. "And he works for the army, for heaven's sake, which makes him a traitor in the eyes of his own people and suspect in ours," Donovan replied with surprising insight. He belongs nowhere, Miss Hargrove. Men like that are easy targets when someone wants to make an example. Elizabeth felt a chill at his words, sensing the depth of prejudice Running Wolf faced. Prejudice so ingrained that even a clear act of heroism could be twisted into something sinister. "The children know what happened," she said finally. "They saw everything." Donovan's eyes widened slightly as he caught her meaning. Hollister won't take kindly to having his authority questioned, especially not by children or their teacher. "Perhaps not," Elizabeth agreed, her resolve hardening. "But I didn't come to the Arizona Territory because it was easy, Mr. Donovan. I came because it was necessary." The Copper Creek schoolhouse was a simple wooden structure at the edge of town, hastily constructed during a brief period of optimism when the mine first struck a rich vein of ore. Its walls leaned slightly to the west, as if perpetually bracing against the desert winds, and its lone bell hung silent in the small tower above the entrance. On this evening, however, the building glowed with lamplight long after its usual hours, and voices could be heard through the open windows. Inside, Elizabeth Hargrove stood before the assembled children and their parents, her normally neat appearance somewhat disheveled after a day that had tested her in ways she could never have anticipated. Yet her posture remained straight, her voice clear and unwavering as she addressed the small crowd. "I've asked you here tonight because a grave injustice has occurred," she began, looking from face to face. "A man who saved our lives is now sitting in jail on false charges, and I believe we have a moral obligation to speak the truth." The 7 children sat in the front row, unusually solemn. Behind them, their parents exchanged uncertain glances. News of the day's events had spread through Copper Creek like wildfire, growing more distorted with each retelling. Some versions cast Running Wolf as a mysterious hero, others as a cunning manipulator. The truth, Elizabeth knew, lay in the simple facts as witnessed by those present. "My daughter says this Apache single-handedly captured the Mason gang," said Mrs. Sullivan, Margaret's mother, a thin woman whose careworn face reflected years of frontier hardship. "Is that true, Miss Hargrove?" "It is," Elizabeth confirmed. "Without Running Wolf's intervention, I fear we might not be here tonight. The Mason brothers were armed and desperate. They had already taken our valuables and were growing increasingly threatening." "James hasn't stopped talking about it," added Mr. Parker, a blacksmith whose powerful arms were folded across his chest, says this Indian scout shot the guns right out of their hands. "That possible, ma'am." "I witnessed it myself, Mr. Parker. 3 shots, fired with extraordinary precision. He could have killed those men, but he chose not to. He showed mercy when he had every right to use deadly force." A murmur ran through the adults. Such marksmanship seemed almost supernatural, though none doubted James's father would have verified the details thoroughly with his son before accepting such a tale. "The sheriff says it could have been a setup," ventured Mr. Thompson, Billy's father, who ran the general store. "Says these Apache have been known to stage rescues to gain trust." "And do you believe that, Mr. Thompson?" Elizabeth asked directly. "Ma, do you believe your son would be deceived so easily? That I would, that Mr. Jenkins, who has driven stagecoaches in this territory for 20 years, would fail to recognize such a deception?" Thompson shifted uncomfortably. "Well, no, but Sheriff Hollister is wrong," Elizabeth stated firmly. "Whether his error stems from personal prejudice or professional jealousy, I cannot say. But I know what I saw, and so do these children." James stood up then, without prompting. "Running Wolf could have left after he caught the outlaws," he said, his young voice steady despite the roomful of adults. "But he made sure we got to Copper Creek safely. He answered our questions and treated us with respect. He didn't talk down to us like we were stupid just because we're kids." One by one, the other children added their accounts. Margaret describing how Running Wolf had patiently shown Sarah the Apache whistle, Thomas admitting sheepishly how his preconceptions had been challenged, little Sarah simply stating he was nice and brave, like in the stories. As the children spoke, Elizabeth watched the parents' expressions change. Doubt gave way to consideration, consideration to concern. These were their children, speaking plainly about what they had experienced. Whatever prejudices the adults might harbor, they could not easily dismiss these heartfelt testimonies. "What exactly are you proposing, Miss Hargrove?" asked Mr. Donovan, who had arrived late and stood at the back of the room. "Sheriff Hollister isn't known for changing his mind once it's set." Elizabeth took a deep breath. "I propose that we, all of us together, go to the sheriff first thing tomorrow morning and demand Running Wolf's release. The children will testify to what they witnessed. Mr. Jenkins has already agreed to add his account. Confront Hollister directly." Mrs. Williams, Sarah's mother, looked alarmed. "And he could make trouble for anyone who crosses him. My husband works as a clerk in the assay office. We can't risk his position." "I understand your concern," Elizabeth said gently. "But ask yourselves this. What lesson do we teach our children if we allow an innocent man to suffer injustice because we fear personal consequences? What kind of community are we building in this new territory?" The room fell silent as her words sank in. Elizabeth had touched on something fundamental, the future they were creating in this frontier land, the values that would shape the society emerging from the dust and struggle of settlement. Mr. Parker was the first to speak. "My boy James looks up to me, watches everything I do." His voice was gruff with emotion. "What kind of man would I be if I taught him to hide from what's right?" He placed a heavy hand on his son's shoulder. "We'll be there, Miss Hargrove." "So will we," said Mrs. Sullivan, though her hands twisted nervously in her lap. One by one, the other parents added their support, some with enthusiasm, others with clear apprehension. Even Mr. Thompson eventually nodded his agreement, muttering something about standing together as a town. As the meeting concluded, Mr. Donovan approached Elizabeth while the others filed out, discussing plans for the morning. "You've started something significant here," he said quietly. "But Hollister won't back down easily. He has a reputation to maintain." "As do we all," Elizabeth replied. "The reputation of Copper Creek is at stake too. Will it be known as a place of justice or prejudice?" Donovan stroked his mustache thoughtfully. "There's something you should know about Hollister. His brother was killed in an Apache raid 6 years ago, a raid led by Diablo, one of the most feared warriors of the time. Hollister has never forgiven or forgotten. That explains his hatred," Elizabeth acknowledged, "but it doesn't excuse his actions today. Running Wolf is not responsible for Diablo's deeds. To a man consumed by grief and rage, all Apache are the same," Donovan said with a sigh. "I'm not defending him, just helping you understand what you're up against." Elizabeth gathered her shawl around her shoulders, suddenly aware of how tired she was. Yet beneath the fatigue burned a determination that would not be quenched. "Thank you for the insight, Mr. Donovan. Will you join us tomorrow?" He hesitated, weighing his position as mine foreman against his conscience. "I'll be there," he finally said. "Not officially, you understand, but as a citizen of Copper Creek who believes in fair treatment for all." Outside the schoolhouse, the night had deepened, stars puncturing the vast Arizona sky with cold brilliance. As Elizabeth walked toward her lodgings, she caught sight of the jailhouse at the far end of the main street, a single lamp burning in its window. Somewhere inside, Running Wolf waited in darkness, alone in a hostile town. "Hold fast," she whispered, though he could not possibly hear. "Help is coming." Morning in Copper Creek arrived with the sharp clarity unique to desert lands, the sun rising over the eastern mountains to cast long shadows across the main street. By 8 o'clock, when most shops would normally be opening their doors, an unusual scene was unfolding outside the jailhouse. What began as a small gathering had swelled to include nearly half the town. At the forefront stood Elizabeth Hargrove, her blue dress freshly pressed, her cameo brooch pinned at her throat like armor. Beside her were the 7 children, scrubbed clean and solemn-faced, their parents standing protectively behind them. Mr. Jenkins leaned on his walking stick nearby, his weathered face set with determination. Even Mr. Donovan had positioned himself prominently among the crowd, his status as mine foreman lending weight to the assembly. Sheriff Hollister emerged from the jailhouse, alerted by the deputy who had nervously informed him of the gathering. He paused on the porch, taking in the scene with narrowed eyes. For a brief moment, uncertainty flickered across his features before his expression hardened into familiar authority. "What's all this?" he demanded, his hand resting near his holstered revolver in what might have been habit or subtle threat. Elizabeth stepped forward. "We've come to speak on behalf of Running Wolf," she said, her voice clear in the morning air. "These children, Mr. Jenkins and I, were witnesses to his heroism yesterday. We demand his release." Hollister's jaw tightened. "This isn't Boston, Miss Hargrove. We don't conduct town meetings to decide matters of law. I've charged the Apache with serious offenses, and he'll face the circuit judge when he arrives." "On what evidence?" called Mr. Parker from the crowd, his blacksmith's voice carrying easily. "My boy says this man saved their lives." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathered townspeople. Hollister's face darkened as he realized the extent of the challenge to his authority. "Evidence," he spat. "I've spent years protecting this territory from Apache raiders. I know their tactics, their deceptions." His voice rose as his control slipped. "They murdered my brother, tied him to a tree and left him to die slow. You people want to take the word of an Indian over mine." An uncomfortable silence fell. Elizabeth felt a surge of pity for the man, despite his cruelty. His pain was real, even if his response to it was deeply wrong. "Sheriff Hollister," she said more gently, "no one doubts your loss or your service to this community. But Running Wolf is not responsible for your brother's death. He works for the U.S. Army, tracking hostile bands to protect settlements like ours." "It's all the same," Hollister insisted, though with less conviction. "No," Elizabeth replied firmly. "It is not the same. And deep down, you know this. Would you condemn a man for the color of his skin rather than the content of his character? Is that the justice you swore to uphold?" Before Hollister could respond, James stepped forward, his young face earnest beneath his cowlick. "Sir," he began with surprising formality, "my pa fought in the war. He says a man should be judged by what he does, not who he is. Running Wolf could have shot those outlaws dead, but he didn't. He could have left us there, but he didn't. He protected us all the way to town, even though—" The boy's voice faltered slightly before strengthening again. "Even though he probably knew how folks would treat him here." One by one, the other children added their accounts, each speaking with the unvarnished honesty of youth. Margaret described how Running Wolf had helped her when she stumbled on the trail. Thomas admitted his own initial fear had given way to respect. Billy recounted how the Apache scout had shared his meager rations when the boy's stomach growled with hunger. Then little Sarah stepped forward, clutching her rag doll in one hand. "Mr. Wolf showed me how to make the special whistle," she said in her small voice. "He said it means, 'I am here,' in Apache. He said sometimes people need to know they're not alone." Something shifted in Hollister's expression, a crack in the hard shell of bitterness he had cultivated for so long. He looked away, his gaze falling on the silent crowd, then back to the earnest faces of the children. Mr. Jenkins spoke up from where he stood. "I've driven coaches in this territory for 20 years, Sheriff. Seen my share of Apache, hostile and peaceful both. This man is no raider. He's a scout doing his duty, and he did it well enough to save these little ones." He gestured toward the children. "That counts for something in my book." "In mine as well," added Mr. Donovan, stepping forward. "Sheriff, none of us can undo the past or bring back those we've lost, but we can choose what kind of future we're building here. Is it one where a man is judged fairly for his actions, or one where old hatreds dictate justice?" The street fell silent again. Elizabeth could almost see the war being waged behind Hollister's eyes. Grief and rage battling against the undeniable weight of testimony and the community's shifting sentiment. "The law is still the law," he said finally, but his voice had lost its edge. "I can't simply then charge me instead," Elizabeth interrupted, surprising even herself with the declaration. "If someone must be held accountable for questioning your authority, let it be me, but release Running Wolf. He's done nothing but serve with honor." A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Hollister stared at her, momentarily speechless at this unexpected offer. "Miss Hargrove," protested Mr. Donovan. "That you can't." "I can, and I will," she said firmly. "What kind of teacher would I be if I didn't stand for truth, even at personal cost?" The children moved closer to her, forming a protective circle. James looked up at the sheriff with defiant loyalty. "If you take Miss Hargrove, you'll have to take me too." "And me," said Margaret. "Me too," echoed Thomas, his voice cracking. One by one, the children voiced their solidarity, their simple courage more powerful than any adult argument could have been. Behind them, parents who had begun the morning with uncertainty now stood tall, moved by their children's example. Hollister's shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly. He looked out at the gathered townspeople, not outsiders or strangers, but men and women he had sworn to protect, children he had watched grow. For perhaps the first time, he saw not just their faces, but their hearts, laid bare in this moment of communal decision. After a long moment, he turned and gestured to his deputy. "Bring out the prisoner." The crowd stirred, uncertain whether this was victory or defeat. Elizabeth held her breath as the deputy disappeared inside the jailhouse, emerging moments later with Running Wolf. The Apache scout walked with dignity despite his bound hands, his expression revealing nothing of his night in captivity. Hollister took a key from his pocket and, with deliberate movements, unlocked the manacles. As they fell away, he stepped back, avoiding Running Wolf's gaze. "The charges are dropped," he announced, his voice gruff with suppressed emotion. "The Mason brothers will be held for the circuit judge. The Apache scout is free to go." A cheer erupted from the children, quickly spreading through the crowd. Elizabeth felt tears pricking at her eyes as relief washed over her. Running Wolf rubbed his wrists where the manacles had chafed, his dark eyes finding hers across the distance between them. "Thank you," she mouthed silently. He inclined his head in acknowledgement, but Elizabeth sensed his gratitude extended beyond her to encompass the children and all who had stood for him. In that moment of connection, the divisions between their worlds seemed less absolute, the barriers less insurmountable. Sheriff Hollister cleared his throat. "I'll be sending a report to Fort Sullivan about the capture of the Mason gang," he said, addressing Running Wolf directly for the first time without hostility. "Your assistance will be noted." It wasn't an apology, but from a man like Hollister, It represented a significant concession. Running Wolf accepted it with a slight nod, neither demanding more nor settling for less. As the crowd began to disperse, their purpose accomplished, the children broke away to surround Running Wolf, peppering him with questions and expressions of relief. To Elizabeth's surprise, he answered them with patience, even offering a rare smile when Sarah demonstrated the whistle he had taught her, now perfected after hours of practice. Later, as Running Wolf prepared to depart for Fort Sullivan, Elizabeth walked with him to the edge of town where his pinto waited, saddled and ready. "I wish you could stay for the children's lessons," she said. "They've learned more from you in one day than I could teach them in a month about courage and dignity." Running Wolf turned to face her, the morning sun illuminating his features. "And I have learned from them," he replied. They see clearly what many adults have forgotten how to see. "Will you come back?" Elizabeth asked, surprising herself with the question. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "The army sends me where I am needed, but perhaps our paths will cross again, Miss Hargrove." "Elizabeth," she corrected gently. "After what we've been through, I think formality is unnecessary." "Elizabeth," he repeated, the name sounding different in his accented voice, invested with respect and something more complex that neither of them sought to define. He mounted his horse with fluid grace, settling into the saddle as naturally as if he were simply standing on higher ground. Looking down at her, he said, "You have a rare gift for teaching truth, Elizabeth Hargrove. These children are fortunate, as am I, to have met you, Running Wolf." With a final nod that conveyed more than words could express, he turned his horse and rode toward the eastern mountains, his silhouette gradually diminishing against the vast landscape, but never truly vanishing from sight until he crested the ridge and passed beyond. Elizabeth watched him go, feeling changed in ways she couldn't fully articulate. When she turned back toward Copper Creek, she saw the children waiting for her at a respectful distance, their faces alight with questions and reflections on all they had witnessed. "Come," she called to them with a smile. "We have much to learn today." And as they walked together toward the schoolhouse, Elizabeth knew that the education unfolding in this frontier town had expanded beyond reading and arithmetic to encompass the most essential lessons of all. Courage in the face of injustice, the strength found in unity, and the transcendent power of seeing beyond differences to the common humanity that binds us all. In the Arizona Territory of 1878, beneath a boundless sky that belonged to no single people, a seed had been planted. What would grow from it remained to be seen. But Elizabeth Hargrove, traveling teacher and unexpected advocate for justice, had never felt more certain of her purpose or more hopeful for the future her students would inherit.